Hello and welcome to the launch of EIT Health Ireland-UK's whitepaper report, Digital Health on Prescription, Is Ireland Ready? My name is Elaine Murray. I'm Communications and Public Affairs Lead here at EIT Health Ireland-UK. We're a regional office of EIT Health, which is Europe's largest health innovation network. We're also part of the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. So let me start by saying thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to what's guaranteed to be an insightful discussion on the topic of reimbursement strategies for digital health technologies. Reimbursement is a key focus area for EIT Health, and over the last 2 to 3 years, each of our EIT Health regional offices has conducted research into the local markets to assess at what stage member states are on the journey to reimbursement, whether this is something that could come into effect soon, and if so, in what capacity. Here in Ireland, we conducted one-to-one interviews with key national and international stakeholders, as well as holding panel discussions on the topic. Our findings have fed into a wider pan-European report, so that was launched yesterday by our central office, and that is called Digital Medical Devices: Path to European Harmonisation. And this shows the bigger picture regarding what needs to take place at a European level first. I do notice that some of the registrants, you've pre-submitted questions, so thank you very much for those. There was one that came in from Medical Valley inquiring as to whether we looked at other models such as Belgium and France. The answer to this is yes. We did examine this at a high level in our local report, but the report that has also been published by our central office goes into further detail, setting out what's happening country by country. So you should have received in the last hour both reports to your inbox, the Irish report and the Pan-European report. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that if you are interested in this topic. So firstly, I'm going to just introduce you to our moderator and panelists for today. I have Fruzsina Mezei, delighted to welcome her today. She's digital health strategist and health economist at EIT Health France. She's a master's graduate in health policy and has worked in a number of advisory roles across organisations such as the National Public Health Centre of Hungary, and her focus is on health technology assessment of digital health innovations. So she helps technology developers navigate this process. She's also coordinating the European Task Force for harmonised evaluation of digital medical devices. So it's something that we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. So thank you, Fruzsina. And she's also joined today by a panellist, Tom Melvin. Tom is Associate Professor of Medical Device Regulatory Affairs at Trinity College, Dublin. He's spent 7 years prior to that at Health Products Regulation Authority, working in the area of medical devices. Tom started out his career as a medical doctor and has since co-chaired working groups at the European Commission, where he served for 5 years. He's led various task forces and projects at national and international level on topics related to medical device regulation. We're also joined by Steven Griffin from Health Innovation Hub Ireland, and he's joining Tom as a panellist today. Steven works closely with the healthcare community and academic institutions such as University of Galway to identify opportunities for innovation and to progress projects based on unmet clinical needs. Steven has a PhD in biotechnology and over 13 years experience in product research and development and commercialization in the life sciences sector, holding roles across biotech multinationals, Science Foundation Ireland, and startups. So back to today, in terms of housekeeping, you can use the Q&A box to submit any questions you may have for us. We'll do our best to answer them throughout. There's also a chat box too, if you'd like to interact with each other. This event is being recorded, so we'll make sure to get a copy of the recording sent to your inbox in the coming days. And if you're on social media and you do want to post about today's event, we're using the hashtag DGETInIreland. So I'd encourage you to do the same. And before we start, we'd like to hear a little bit from you and your perspective and opinion on this topic of reimbursement and whether, firstly, it's needed here. So I'm going to launch our first poll, and if you could respond with your thoughts. So does Ireland need a standardised reimbursement pathway for digital health technologies? Yes, no, not sure. Okay. So results are in, right? I'm glad we conducted this research, so that's reassuring. And the second poll that we're doing today, when do you expect a reimbursement pathway for digital health technologies to be implemented in Ireland specifically? Okay, I'll share the results. Quite mixed opinions on that one, but again, this will all kind of be discussed over the next half an hour, 40 minutes. So back to today. With that, it's my pleasure to hand over to Fruzsina, our moderator for today's event. She's going to explain a little bit more about what's happening across Europe in terms of reimbursement strategies for digital health technologies. So thank you, Fruzsina.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and welcome to this webinar from my side as well. My name is Fruzsina Mezei, and I am coordinating the European Task Force on Harmonized Evaluation of DMDs at EIT Health. And in 2019, a DiGA fast track was implemented in Germany, which essentially meant that physicians could prescribe low risk and class 1 or 2A digital health apps or web-based platforms to patients, and the health insurance fund would pay for it like it pays for some pharmaceuticals and procedures. To date, there are actually 41 apps already in the DiGA directory that were assessed and can be reimbursed in Germany. To get in this DiGA directory, the technology developers need to submit a dossier with evidence about several domains on their products, such as safety, sustainability for use, data protection, information security standards, etc., as well as evaluation and evidence on the DiGA's positive healthcare effect. This has to be proven in a given indication and in the population where the DiGA is supposed to be used. So following the launch of the DiGA fast track in 2019, President Macron announced to replicate this model in France. And you might be aware that since then, several European countries are looking to do the same by actively developing related assessment approaches. So now turning to our panelists and to more specifically towards today's focus on Ireland. Steven, would you care to set out the landscape for digital health and medtech in Ireland?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for this opportunity to speak. So I'll probably come at it just as a broader perspective and then move in and just say that Ireland has a fairly unique ecosystem here to support new business development in digital health, medtech, and otherwise. It is maybe one of the only countries in the world where the government, through Enterprise Ireland and other organisations, provides funding or investment for companies to develop their businesses at very favourable terms and low risk to the promoters. And there are a number of mechanisms here to support commercialization of research and development through partnerships with academia, through funds. I think the DTIF is mentioned in the report, innovation vouchers and industry partnerships. And on the other side, then there is a pipeline of funding supports for business development from the New Frontiers program through to Series A investment via the HPSU program. And in addition, there is a vibrant medtech and pharma sector in Ireland that has been cultivated over the past 30 to 40 years. There are hundreds of medical device companies operating in Ireland, with 9 of the 10 top largest multinationals based here. And over the years, in response to this foreign direct investment, the academic sector and the government set up and delivered relevant courses, training and support to meet the high skilled labour demand. And then there's a whole lot of other supports that sprung up around that, including the Health Research Board clinical trials facilities around the country, groups like the Health Innovation Hub that I work for, that we do unregulated studies, work such as human factor testing, design validation, focus group with expert panels and key opinion leaders, and then programs like the BioInnovate program in the University of Galway that produce medtech startups. And then kind of softer and around the outside of that, then there is a close-knit community of businesses and technical people willing to help others here in Ireland. These are generally people who have perhaps exited a company in the past and they just want to give back. So in addition, now more recently, Enterprise Ireland have also set up, in tandem with their technology centres and technology gateways. These facilitate companies working with research institutions. They have set up clusters for businesses working in connected health and well-being, and another one for digital health, which really kind of recognises the growth of digital health in Ireland and the push in that area. Of course, there's some challenges remain in terms of the market size in Ireland, and that most medtech companies would have a larger target markets in their sites, such as the US, the UK, or Germany. And again, talk more about this later on, but the FDA has a much faster and cheaper regulatory approval process system than the EMA, which I suppose entices companies to focus on that in the first instance. And I suppose as we'll dive into it for digital therapeutics, the regulatory pathways in Ireland and probably in the EU countries is still a little bit unclear.
Thank you, Steven. Tom, would you care to elaborate on the landscape a bit from the regulatory and reimbursement perspective?
Thank you, Fruzsina, and thank you, Elaine, for the kind introduction. I guess, when we think about the reimbursement world for medical devices, if we look back over the last decade or so, I think as a general point in Europe, it's less well developed than we have for drugs. And I guess in Ireland, we're also a relatively smaller member states compared to, Germany, who started this DIGA initiative, and France, where they would have, hundreds of file assessments per year for reimbursement decisions. So, I guess thinking of the potential that we have with a DIGA type model where, in Germany, they decided to do things very differently. We're getting medical doctors to write prescriptions, something you usually do for a medicine, but they do it for an app. You're getting BfArM, which is a competent authority in the regulatory world I'm in, who are looking at a reimbursement decision for a health app and looking at clinical benefit, and then tying that together to allow the health system to fund it through their national insurance model. When you think of Ireland and the kind of institutions that we have here, I guess we probably need to think about, firstly, a national policy. There's a number of organizations in Ireland who are very expert at dealing with, health technology assessment. For example, we have HIQA, the Health Information and Quality Authority. We used to have a health technology assessment part in the HSE, but I don't think that's active anymore. I used to sit on it a couple of years ago. And we also have the BfArM equivalent in Ireland called HPRA, Health Products Regulatory Authority. That's the competent authority for devices in Ireland, where I used to work. They would have, a department of about 35 people, but only a small number of them, something like 2 or 3 people working on software. So I think if we wanted to try and realize a clear model for reimbursement and looking at clinical benefit, cost efficacy, and those kind of things, I think we'd have to look to Ireland and see what can we leverage from those various organizations to see how can we utilize the best benefit. And from my perspective, we've had a great proof of concept from the DIGA model in Germany, and it shows that if people think slightly differently or do things as organizations in a slightly different way, that can get you a viable model. I would love to see some way that we could try to leverage assessments so that we could trust each other. That's a big part of what you'll see in things like the Health Technology Assessment Regulation, where there's a move to have a single clinical evidence assessment done for all of Europe. So hopefully we can utilize some of that kind of thinking and some of that synergy to try and get something that will have to be agile for Ireland, because we're a smaller member state with smaller organizations, but that we can try and leverage these assessments together.
So jumping right in the middle, do you believe that a similar scheme to the German DIGA would be beneficial to Ireland, or would you do it differently?
I think that a clear pathway to show how we can reimburse these kind of technologies, I think that would be a huge benefit for the development community and for people to bring products to market. As to how clean a fit it will be for Ireland, I guess, I mentioned already the size difference, but we also have a difference in terms of, I guess, two key things. There's a health insurance system used in Germany, whereas we have a more public health system. So there will be some differences there. And I guess the other thing that would be a major challenge for Ireland is that we're somewhat bedeviled by the absence of electronic health records and patient identifiers in Ireland. We do have, and I'm no expert here, but in our primary health system, so general practitioners, they quite commonly now use digital health and online platforms for electronic health records. It's not something that's part of our hospital system. But even through primary care and family doctors, and there's still a huge number, if you look through the list of those 41 apps who are now on the DIGA red, of those could fit into a primary care model and find a distribution way there. But I guess we do have some significant differences. And I guess to my mind, that's not an absolute barrier, but it just means we have to have a clear strategy. So, I guess the Department of Health would be probably in the best place to look across the different organizations and look at the commonalities and differences and then see how we could target something. So we could do something for sure here, but we just have to have some slightly nuanced strategies, I think.
Steven, what do you think? How would Irish startups and health technology developers benefit from such a framework?
Oh, I think a lot of people would benefit from it. First, I'll just go through kind of a list I had in my head. I'm thinking for patients to have more treatment options. Patients may not always wish to go down the pharmacological or the surgical routes as the first treatment option, if that's what it is, and to have maybe a digital therapeutic or something similar as an option would be fantastic, like Amara Therapeutics. It'd also be good for the healthcare providers to have additional treatment options, maybe stuff that's less invasive, that deliver therapeutic value based on evidence. I think that will be welcome. And in a broader sense, any treatment, therapy, intervention, including remote monitoring or telemedicine, which facilitate greater connectivity between patients and carers, should be welcome. And there are many examples of people traveling in this country hours for checkups to the acute hospital system from remote parts of Ireland that could and are starting to be done remotely. Like quality of life is a massive factor for a lot of people. So there's companies like Zendra Health, Salasso, Wallola, Isaac Care that are all working in this space. As with DIGA, I think the opportunity to gather clinical evidence on the fly as you're going is a win-win for everyone involved. Anything that provides a guaranteed income for a company, particularly a startup over a defined time period, would I imagine would be welcomed. And in the report as well, it mentions the speed at which digital and software is developed. So fast everything is hugely important for implementation, deployment, and the commercial success of solutions. So I think if there was a way to get something similar, as Tom said, it may not be like for like. I think it will be hugely beneficial.
Yes, thank you for the insights, and I'm sure you're aware that since the implementation of the fast track, Germany has been facing some challenges and also some backlash. For example, Tom, you mentioned the electronic health record, so they are still prescribing the DIGAs on paper, so the patient actually gets a paper in their hand with the code which they need to put into a browser to access the web-based platform or the digital health apps. But it's also a trend that prescriptions of DIGAs have been lagging behind. So it's the uptake is not as expected, and that's frankly because they didn't put enough resources in educating the public and making sure that there was social acceptance of these solutions. They didn't educate the healthcare professionals that like the healthcare professionals, of course, they need to prescribe it, but also the patients who are supposed to use it. So I think it's clear that Germany is a pioneer in this sense, and countries have the opportunity now to learn from Germany from whatever they did right, but also from their mistakes. But looking at the big picture, I think there is actually a huge challenge, which is the European fragmentation, which Steven mentioned briefly in the beginning, as opposed to the FDA, where there is a huge unified market that's much easier to tackle for digital health solutions and technology developers. And while there are already some overlaps of countries' frameworks, we can see several differences in what member states are even in what they are choosing to include in the scope of digital health technologies that fit in their assessment framework. And what we can see is that DIGAs are so far mostly low-risk health apps and web-based platforms, but other countries like France and Finland, for example, they are also integrating telemedicine or AI-based solution and even robotics in these frameworks. But what we see is also a differentiation and differences regarding the evidence criteria, and not just the clinical evidence criteria, but all the domains, and also the study characteristics that HTA bodies are requesting for this evaluation. And of course, so far, randomized controlled trials have been the gold standard for evidence generation, but most of the time the design is unfit to evaluate digital health technologies. And I just looked before this webinar, just very briefly to have an updated information that from the 41 positively assessed apps in the DIGA directory, 40 decisions were made based on RCTs. So they do allow alternative study designs, but they don't actually accept any DIGAs that prove or that provide evidence based on alternative evidence designs. So I think there are several questions where countries' frameworks differ. For example, what comparator they are using when measuring digital health technology efficacy, or for example, what's the standard of care. So it's really difficult, but I think that generally we can say that technology developers and startups are in the dark regarding what's expected of them. And we need to provide them with some clear guidelines, because otherwise this will be a very resource-intensive process with double funding studies, not just because they are not because they don't provide adequate evidence, but also because something different is expected in each country. So we had a short question from the audience on when it's expected, when such a framework is expected to be implemented in Ireland, and the audience said in about the next 5 years. So Tom, what do you think? What's realistic to be implemented in the Irish context in the next 5 years?
It's a great question. Trying to predict the future is something I'm always kind of very cautious about. I suppose if we leave the reimbursement question out of the way for a second, the use of these digital health technologies is likely to become more prevalent simply by consumers accessing them through app stores and finding them themselves, etc. So I think it's going to grow in terms of the kind of uptake and use. And, I guess as it's reflected in the reports published today, COVID-19 and the rapid response and the need to move care from hospital to home and telemedicine and those kind of things probably turbocharged that to a great extent. Family doctors who would never have had remote consultations were doing it routinely all of a sudden. So I think that is going to drive a lot of the change. When it comes to policy, it's always really difficult to give a timeline. But, I think there's the task force that you're part of, Fruzsina, and I guess that will help with things like taxonomy and what would be best practice for clinical methodology and questions like that. So I think it will help tee up on the policy side, how you can start to shape these things. We have a huge amount of change going on the regulatory side. We have a quite new health technology assessment regulation where those institutions and practices are coming into effect for the first time for a lot of the regulatory requirements there. And on the medical device regulation side, there's a huge amount of change, and a lot of the products, for DIGA, they're Class 1 or Class 2A. When you apply the new medical device regulation, a lot of these products will go from Class 1 to a higher risk classification requiring notified body assessment. So there's a huge amount of regulatory change in the sector. And I'm very conscious that the rules that we apply were often developed with physical products in mind. So trying to apply, the clinical evidence rules, but a host of other parts of the medical device regulation is a real challenge. Things like labeling and even some of the clinical study design aspects you mentioned, they're really different considerations for software. So I think once the technical parts are done, it will be there for policymakers to be able to apply it in member states like in Ireland. Coming back to your question, it's very hard to know when. If I was optimistic, 5 years could be good, but I'm not sure.
I definitely agree with you, Tom. Steven, before closing the discussion and moving to the Q&A, what do you think are the next steps for Ireland to realize a framework where prescribing digital health apps is possible?
Oh, yeah, I think Tom covered a lot of it there. For me, 5 years is probably optimistic. Look, I think there's, just in my opinion, it looked like the regulatory pathways and say in terms of clinical evidence and that for, say, medical devices was templated on that for pharma. And we might very well fall into the trap of doing the same thing for digital therapeutics and digital health technologies. And it does need a kind of fresh break, just particularly the time and how quickly they can be realized and implemented. That should be acknowledged, and the risk assessment on the safety and their efficacy in that should really be considered to I suppose support faster yet robust regulatory processes for it. So getting these frameworks in together in quick time, I don't have the answer for Ireland, but it definitely will require a lot of stakeholder involvement, particularly as Tom had mentioned, in terms of the healthcare system here. In our acute system, we don't have EHRs across the board or electronic health records. So there's a lot of work. People are open to it. They are looking for it. It's one of the most, I suppose, noted needs in our healthcare system, is that kind of unique patient identifier, that all their information is one place, and why not then build on top of that?
Thank you, Steven. Just very briefly reflecting on the European landscape towards the end of our discussion, we can really see that there is a common understanding of many European countries regarding a need to develop a tailored market access for digital health solutions to give patients an earlier and more timely access to effective and innovative digital technologies. But we can also see that there are almost as many approaches as there are health systems in Europe. And I want to point out that along with an analysis on the state of digital healthcare transformation in European member states, EIT Health has outlined a set of recommendations in their pan-European white paper that Elaine has also shared with us, along with the Irish white paper, and it contains several recommendations for stakeholders on the market. The key messages of these white paper is while there is a huge potential to unify the EU market for digital health technologies by setting these common standards, by setting a common evidence criteria, by harmonizing the taxonomy, and by giving recommendations on how to increase social uptake, there is still need for acknowledging national competencies of member states, especially in their reimbursement process. And if you'd like to have more insight on the harmonization endeavors across Europe, please keep an eye out for the updates on the European DMD task force. will be publishing a consensus paper with first results towards the middle or end of April. And just as a quick information or background on this task force, it is chaired by the French Ministerial e-health delegation and co-chaired by EU-NAT HTA. And the recommendations will be fed into the HTA regulation that Tom already mentioned, and that entered into force in 2022 and will apply as of 2025. So in the remaining couple of minutes, let me just quickly check how much time we have left. Let's address some of the questions that were submitted. As Elaine said, we had several pre-submitted questions, but we also have a couple of questions in the chat. So let's start with a pre-submitted question from Roche. What is the patient's involvement in designing and implementation of digital health technologies? And this I would like to give to Steven.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think the patient involvement is massively important. I think, and to get patient involvement as early in the design and development process as possible is critical. A lot of healthcare professionals may only have episodic encounters with patients, and as such, they may not know enough about the lived experience outside of their care. There's a company here in Galway called Luminate Medical, and they're working on a device for people who are going through chemotherapy to help reduce hair loss. Hair loss is it shows that chemotherapy is working, and this is the clinician's view of it. Well, if they're losing their hair, the treatment is working, but it meant something completely different to the patients. And I mentioned the DTIF grant there earlier. Luminate were recipients of a DTIF, and this wouldn't have been flagged as a need by the clinical people, really. And there are other such examples as, say, Hydromed, Rockfield Medical, they're all based on patient lived experience. So it's hugely important not to have the patients just as part of a clinical trial or something like that, but to get their informed opinion early on. What are the users comfortable with using in respect to technology, in the case of digital health technologies, what are they familiar with? What are they comfortable with? What's their demographic? Blue Drop Medical, they've a device. It is designed to fit into a person's morning routine. This product, which detects diabetic foot ulcers, it looks like a digital weighing scale. So it's very easy and very familiar concept to patients. So I can't extol how important it is to engage with the patients or the people on the ground who will be using your perceived product. It's massively important.
Thank you, Steven. Another pre-submitted question for Tom, which I think is very relevant. What barriers do you perceive to the uptake of such a framework in Ireland?
Well, I guess we need to understand what a national policy would look like. So I mentioned, a number of the organizations with expertise and experience in this area in general. But I guess we would really need to tie that together as a national strategy to understand, if Ireland wants to adopt a DIGA model and wants to allow, doctors to provide health apps to patients with funding provided by the state, we would need to understand, to what extent do we want our National Health Service or HSE? They have living labs and do a lot of work on digital health technologies. The competent authority, which will be a little bit like how BfArM work in Germany for DIGA. And we have HICWA, who do larger and detailed health technology assessments and have a huge amount of experience for, clinical efficacy assessments and things like that in-house. We just need to figure out how to tie those relevant parts together to see how we would do it for Ireland. So I guess that's the first barrier, is to understand, do we want to provide a bespoke reimbursement model for digital health technologies in Ireland? And once we do, then we have to figure out who is going to do that. And then you fall into the usual challenge of, public policy, which is resources and funding and open those kind of pathways. But we need to understand the general strategy for us as a member state first, and then we can fill in the gaps.
Thank you, So let me just quickly look in the chat whether we have some live questions, and yes, we do. And the first one is from David. Are these devices medical devices? So maybe I can start answering this question, and then I can hand over to either Steven or Tom, because there is a second part of the question with Irish relevance. So the frameworks that I've been talking about so far, yes, these are medical devices, and so far all frameworks across Europe request so they request a CE mark in order to be evaluated and be further evaluated by this assessment framework. David is also asking if a digital health device has a medical device claim, do you both need MDR certificate and the Irish version DIGA pathway?
I can help with that, Fruzsina.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom, please.
So, I guess maybe the point here is that your CE mark is your market enablement. So if you meet the definition of a medical device to market that product in Europe, in the European Union, you need to have a CE mark. So you have to go through what's called conformity assessment. Under the old rules called the Medical Device Directive, an awful lot of these products fell into class 1. And that has a self-certification pathway. You don't have to go for a third-party assessment. Under the medical device regulation rules now, there's something called Rule 11 in the classification rules, and that adopts a risk-based classification. So if you fall into one of the higher risk categories, 2A, 2B, or 3, those products need a notified body assessment prior to marketing. So I guess market enablement and CE marking is one side, and DIGA is looking at another thing called reimbursement or health technology assessment. And I guess just a final brief comment, when you look across the app stores, we have over 350,000 health apps available worldwide. If you look at Europe, we don't certify that number of products. So it's a slightly chaotic market now, and that there's probably lots of people marketing digital health apps that probably meet the definition of a medical device, but are probably not regulated as such. So it's an area where I guess the sector is still one that generally has to come into compliance.
Thanks, Tom. So there is a very specific question from Rory. And the question is, what's the best path to identify a focus group to help validate the solution's suitability for Ireland's healthcare system?
I can take a stab at that. The Health Innovation Hub, we have an innovation portal. It's on our website, www.hih.ie. And our role really is to do this, is to assess your ask and then try and find the right people for you to talk to, if we can do it within the healthcare system. So if you want to link in with us.
Thank you, Steven. Maybe the next question will also go to you. Do you think gaining evidence for digital therapeutics in Ireland might be slow due to the difficulties in gaining ethical approval and GDPR?
Quick answer on this one. It depends on what your solution is, but for the most part, ethical approval. No, it's not that difficult as long as you have everything lined up as it should be, and you have your proper security and risk assessment done. It is fairly straightforward, whether you're doing it at a local level within the hospital or the community healthcare organizations, or you're going through the new national ethics, the NREC. It is fairly straightforward. It's a long document, and it covers GDPR for the most part. Where you will run into some challenges if you want to integrate directly with a PAS system or the kind of internal electronic systems within an acute hospital or otherwise, it will need to go through the DPO, and there's a bit of a bottleneck in some institutions around that area. That's for your the term's gone out of my head. The DPIA, sorry, yeah.
Thank you, Steven. Guido is asking, what is the main challenge to homogenizing the evaluation criteria? I think I will take that. So the main challenges that we are having, we are working on 3 aspects of harmonization. The first one is the taxonomy and the categorization. The second one is harmonizing the clinical evaluation criteria. And the third one is giving a suggestion or recommendation for social uptake, so increasing social uptake. And really the main challenge is that there are several aspects that still need to remain national competencies that we cannot actually harmonize because health systems are so different. So the main aspect in regards of harmonization that we are looking at is only the clinical evidence domain, because that's the easiest to transfer across borders. Let me see the next questions. Fiona is asking, there is an interest across Europe in moving towards multi-component pathways in reimbursement. This means that companies would need to partner with others in order to be part of a pathway. Yes, where is the question? Any suggestions on how we could create an ecosystem which encourages this type of collaboration and also protects smaller startups?
I suppose I put my hand up. I know I can part answer this, Fiona. There's something similar out there for procurement and for tenders, and a lot of the people who work on those in the public sector are that help people get to write their tenders and that are to apply for them. Do kind of matchmaking services to put a smaller company with a larger company so that together they'll meet all the criteria. So it's not directly answering your question, but there are kind of examples of it in terms of tenders and procurement.
Thank you, Steven. I'm now looking at Elaine on how much time we have left, but there are still several questions. So I think I would now close this discussion and thank you, Steven and Tom, so much for this stimulating conversation. Thank you all for the attendees for being with us today. And with this, I am handing now over to Elaine to close the discussion.
So thank you so much, Fruzsina, for that. We've obviously had quite a number of questions coming through, which you've mentioned. So we will do our best to address as many of those as possible over email. We'd also love to hear your feedback on the event today. So I've just pasted a link into the chat if you had time to complete the feedback survey. It's very short, it's just 3 questions. And I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panelists. This was a thought-provoking discussion and I feel like we've just scratched the surface. So there is a lot more to come. If you are interested in this topic, please download the report. It's in your inbox now, along with the wider European report. Thank you to our audience for participating in this event, and I hope you did find this discussion insightful. So with that, we do have several open opportunities at EIT Health, whether you're a researcher or startup founder. We have an open flagships call at the moment for researchers, and for healthcare professionals, we have a number of different educational programs open. And on Monday, we opened 8 accelerator programs for startups. So I'll paste the links into the chat now if you are interested in getting involved. But other than that, thank you very much for joining today, and we'll see you again soon.